From LPM,
Louisville Public Media.
Support comes from the Eye Care Institute and Butchertown Clinical Trials, where they strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion within their staff, patients, and clinical trial participants. To learn more, visit butchertown.clinic.
Sprinkle Sparkle contains adult themes and may not be suitable for all ages.
Access to pleasure and indulgence is our right, and we're entitled to it. It's not a favor that somebody's granting us. It's not a reward. It's just like why we're here. My hope is that people will listen to this and relate, even in the ugly parts, because there's something sparkling about that too. Welcome to Sprinkle Sparkle. I'm Nubia Bennett. And today we are talking with State Representative Attica Scott and her daughter, Ashanti.
My name is Ashanti, and I am a third-year political science student at the University of Louisville. And I'm also a former pharmacy technician. I used to work at Walgreens. Yeah, that's just a little bit about me.
I am Attica Scott, State Representative for Kentucky House District 41. I'm a mama who is running for Congress, and I will be the first woman, Democratic woman, ever elected to Congress from Kentucky.
What you both didn't do was tell me why the two of you would be on here at the same time.
Yeah, for about 21 years, I've been the mom to Ashanti.
When we think about pleasure, well, at least for me, it was really important that I spoke to a mother and a daughter. I mean, for lots and lots of reasons. Because when we think about, Black women, in particular, and the lived experience of Black mothers and Black daughters specifically, and how often there are these stories of just generational stuff. Like, I could say trauma, I could say lots of things. But I mean, of course, I didn't want to talk to them about generational trauma. That's not what that's not what this conversation is about. But just the relationship with pleasure throughout generations was what I was after. Especially as we look to pleasure as an act of resistance, as a path to healing, and as something that leads us to joy or is joyful. For me, both me personally and just as a person that's curious about pleasure and joy. And so talking to them is always pleasurable for me because I'm aging myself a little bit, but I remember Ashanti when she was just like literally like a little girl. And I've known Representative Scott since I was a little girl almost, so hence the reason why I've known Ashanti for that long. And I mean, watching her on her journey, on her professional journey, from, running for the school board back in the day, to running for Congress, right? Being on her path to being, the first, her road to trying to be the first Black woman congresswoman in the state of Kentucky, which this time it didn't happen, but this time, right? Just watching that journey, as a person who aimed to be a professional my whole life, has been, its own thing, right? So, of course, I'm going to interview her for that, right? I'll interview her for everything for that reason. But beyond that, looking at the relationship of joy and pleasure and the pursuit of both of those things, along with watching her now grown daughter and their relationship to each other, I think that is something that needed to be highlighted as we're all on this journey, or a journey for that together. So that was why I had to talk to them. And it was really interesting because just looking at the similarities between their viewpoints but also the very stark differences that I got to highlight just in that single conversation was worth noting as well.
What is the definition of pleasure to you?
For me, I think the definition of pleasure is just something I get a lot of enjoyment and fulfillment out of. And when I think of something that brings me pleasure, it's like something that really doesn't have any negative aspects to it. Like it brings like a ray of positivity in my life and kind of like almost a de-stressor, because I think in my life, there's a lot going on. So I think things that bring me pleasure help me not even think about the task of the day or, what my to-do list or my assignments, none of that. It's just something that I can enjoy completely without distraction and without stress.
Mm. And yes, and for me, pleasure is what I can give to other people as well. Like I get joy, which is also pleasure, when I am, I don't know, in community with people that I care about and I love deeply, and I see how their lives change. And if I'm any contribution to that, there's just this like overwhelming sense of, yes, that's the energy. That's the whole thing I want flowing through my body, is seeing you do well. And if I was able to do any little bit to help you do well, it's pleasure.
I love this overwhelming sense of yes. I had to like write that down and underline it and put in quotation marks. Would you all, what would you say would be the shared definition between the two based on what you both said?
So Shonda Rhimes wrote a book a few years ago called The Year of Yes, where you say yes to everything. And I think a friend of mine still has that book because I don't see it on my bookshelf. But yes, yeah, the overwhelming sense of yes.
I guess I'm not really sure, like, for me, like, I don't want to be too much of a yes person, because I think that the enjoyment is boundaries. So when there's something, to say no to. So I think like, I'm not really a yes person. Sometimes I gotta be like, nah, I can't do that.
I like that too, actually. But so then, okay, so we can expand that then, because it's like, you're saying yes to what you want to say yes to. So an overwhelming sense of yes within the boundary of no.
I like that. Okay, yeah, that's it right there.
I got it. Okay. So our shared definition for pleasure then is an overwhelming sense of yes within the boundaries of no. We must think about the roots of where this definition of pleasure came from for you. And what has been your relationship to pleasure in the past? And you can go as far back or as recently as you'd like, but in the past, wherever you notice the change.
Yeah, I think the definition for me, it just kind of came from almost like self-care. And so I think I intertwined that with pleasure in my relationship, in my definition of pleasure. And I think that kind of changed for me, honestly, probably when I got to college. But like in high school, it was like I was very spontaneous. Like I just put self-care and pleasure, things I liked, at the top. Like after school, I'm going to get ice cream if that's what I want to do instead of doing homework. And so, that was like top of my priorities. And versus now, it's like I have all these things that I have to, be committed to. And so pleasure is almost like now an afterthought versus in high school, it was a top priority.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. I have to think about, when did it shift? If there was a shift. There's some things I feel like I was born into, and that were granted to me by my parents. And that's that sense of justice and the pleasure of being in community with other people. and having and growing up with this sense of being able to say yes to myself without feeling guilty for saying no to other people. Like that's just been something that they instilled in me. I would say though that if there was a shift, it probably was when I started serving in elected office at the local level, because it was different. It was a different kind of tangible way of supporting people in seeking their pleasure and seeking their joy in a more concrete way, rather than this kind of like, oh, my family members and friends, and we're all in this, in a different, we are all in this together. Like we're not, as family and friends out in the world, we're not necessarily all in this together because we're in different places. But I was able to see a way of impacting people's lives and making a difference on people's lives as an elected official. So for me, I would say that's when the shift came for me, in understanding that true impact of being part of people's joy and pleasure.
So in your case, Attica, it's almost like it became real that and even I would almost argue yours too, Ashanti. It's almost like, oh, this personal is very political. So it's almost like a shift where it's like, oh, I'm getting to say yes. My yes to myself is possibly a no to someone else, but that's okay. But then you're like, oh, okay, so I can say yes to myself, no to this, but I'm also like giving other people that right too, by protecting their rights, or by, in your case, Ashanti, is committing to these longer term goals that may not be pleasurable in the moment. I think of assignments and I think of meetings and things like that, right? And then you're like, but this actually, not only it helps me, because we know you're involved with so many other things. It's like, oh, well, I'm saying yes to this or no to this now, because I'm also expanding that. I hear like an idea of expansion. The role of being, well, I mean, would you, Ashanti, can you tell me more then about this idea? Were you able to say yes to yourself or no? What about you growing up? Because your mom basically says that she was told early, say yes to yourself, whatever that means. What about you? You're not on trial here, of course.
Right. I think I definitely, I'm not really sure. Like, I think my early memories, I'm pretty sure that I got, told to say yes to myself. I definitely think like, in my household, we definitely prioritize, our health and stuff like that. But I think naturally, like, just kind of like the way schools upbring kids now, and myself included, it's like you're not really supposed to put yourself first. Like, there's not really time for mental health check-ins or anything like that. Like, you go to school and then you have homework and then you do that. But I think and you still perfect attendance. I could get on a whole thing about.
That's why I said that is his own podcast right there.
Literally, like, so like I feel like those forces kind of like constrained how much I was able to do. But I definitely think like once I got older, especially around that high school age, and once I started driving myself, I was like, look, y'all can't in, like, I'm putting me first. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Which actually, it means something different. To your point, it means something different at 16 or 17. You're like, I don't want to do that, so I'm not doing it. Whereas I think, like, to your, again, that idea of that shift of like, oh, well, I mean, I don't want to do this, but that feeling, deciding which organizations you want to give your time to, or like, I think that is still an idea of centering your pleasure. I mean, it's work involved, but you commit yourself to the things you want to commit to. I think it just comes up as a kid as I don't want to do this, so I'm not doing that. I'm giving me some ice cream instead, right? But so that idea of saying yes to yourself impacts then your ability to say no to things, I think, when you get older, then, is what I'm hearing for the both of you. then. But I mean, go ahead. Yes.
And I was just going to say, and like you said, it also kind of models or shows for other people what that looks like, right? Because they are always looking for, people are almost always looking for that, someone or something to show them a different way forward, right? That it doesn't always have to be the way that you were brought up or the way the society tells you things have to be. So I think people do often look for who's doing it differently, right? Who's seeking their joy and their pleasure in a different way that I can look at and model, right?
So yeah, that you actually leads me to my very next question. There have been people I've asked this question to, and they're like, there was nobody. Everybody did as they were supposed to do, and everybody grew up tired. Everybody's tired, and I knew I needed to do it a different way. Who did you see that just lived, embodied pleasure or embodied themselves in a way that you was like, oh, I need to do that. That's what I need to do.
For me, again, it was my family. Just picking up off of the previous conversation. And not only my mother and my father, but I lived with my great aunt and uncles, different ones at different times. And one great uncle who was, a veteran as well as a union laborer, like I saw him getting high, right? Because of the emotional stuff he went through and serving in the military and active duty, but also the physical pain that he had experienced as a laborer, but also we brought him pleasure, right? And so he wasn't concerned about explaining to somebody why he got high. It wasn't their business. But he knew that it brought him pleasure and it helped relieve some pain. So that was like him just living in his truth and not being concerned about what anyone thought. And then I would see the women in my family who were some of the strongest women I've ever seen in my life, who did what they wanted to do as they wanted to do it. Didn't answer to anyone and didn't ever make me think like as if I needed to answer to people for the decisions I was making in my life. So I got to give a huge shout out to my family, and in particular the women in my family, because they showed me a different way. They showed me what it meant not to have to conform to what society has told you have to be. I mean, most of them grew up during the civil rights movement. So that was like a whole another level of challenging systems that didn't want us to have pleasure as Black people, right? And saying, you know what, despite these systems, despite these institutions, despite these structures, they were still going to go for it anyway.
For me, I feel like in high school, like when I was on that wave, I was like, I'm not, forget all this other stuff, I'm gonna do what I like. I don't think I really had anybody as a model for that, because like I'm a Scorpio, so we're very like, we're to ourselves, and so that's kind of how I got, believe it or not, but that's how
you was born this way.
But that's really like in high school, that was kind of me. So I kind of just did what was best for myself because I knew that's just what I needed and that's what I liked. And then I think now I don't really take as much pleasure, but I think that something that has really inspired me is the great resignation, what they're calling it, of like my generation, where we're quitting jobs that we don't find pleasure in. And I think that has really that's been like a reality check to me, because I quit my job and it was like, because that job sucked. And so it was like, we're like, this stuff, that's not for our best interest, that's not serving us pleasure, like seeing young people and my generation like demanding more, and we're like, if we're not going to get it here, we'll find it somewhere else. And I think that the pandemic and all of that has really, reshifted my focus back to my own pleasure.
Yeah, no. So, and you bring up the pandemic too. How has that impacted your relationship to how you relate to pleasure? I mean, how's that impacted your relationship to pleasure? I mean, all the phases of this pandemic, right? The slowing down and then the ridiculously speeding up. Has that impacted the way you engage with pleasure?
Yeah, for me, it definitely has, because like in high school, for sure, like I definitely found pleasure in hanging out with friends and like doing stuff and going to parties. And it was like with the pandemic, I had to find something else to do. Like I'm not hanging around y'all and getting COVID. So it's like, I have to find other things and be more comfortable just being alone. And like, finding pleasure in everyday activities that I can do with myself and like self-care and things like that. So I think that that's kind of how the pandemic changed me. It just was like, I gotta work on my relationship with myself and not rely on the presence of other people or the influence of other people to be, my sole or my main form of getting pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And while this is audio, so people won't be able to see my background, most of the times when I'm on a video call, people can see my bookshelf behind me. And, like Ashanti, during the pandemic, I had to find what are those other ways that I find pleasure. And I reconnected with my books. And I found that joy and that pleasure in my reading, in my action, adventure, sci-fi, Black lit, like just reconnecting, reading books I hadn't read in years and digging into them, having conversations with people about books, making recommendations for folks about new reading material like that. That was a different way of figuring out how do I find pleasure in the midst of such pain and in the midst of a pandemic, but also in the midst of racial uprising and police accountability, if I can spit out the word, accountability. How in the world do you find pleasure when you're literally fighting for your life or that of other people and literally running for your life? That's hard to say that for me that I was able to find much pleasure in 2020, but 2021 has shown me that I can never forget that I have to take care of myself in order to be able to help take care of other people.
Still thinking about how we had to slow down in so many ways. And then this abrupt speed up. Like, oh, let's get back to normal. Mm-hmm. Like, how has that impacted you?
Well, it's impacted me on a different level, I would say, than for some folks, because I'm also an elected official who's had to spend this entire time responding to constituents. I represent about 44,000 people from the East End to the West End of Louisville. And there was a period of time where every single week we were getting multiple emails and phone calls from people who weren't receiving their unemployment insurance benefits. One gentleman who lives here in the West End, who was a veteran, couldn't eat. He could not go out and buy food. He didn't have groceries. So we connected him to the Black Market KY so they could go deliver food to his home so he wouldn't have to go out because he suffered with a disability and we're in a pandemic. He just couldn't take that risk. So it was different for me having that weight, and that responsibility to also show up for folks and do whatever I could to help make sure that they had their basic human needs met. I don't know that there was pleasure in that, but there was joy in those moments when we could help make a difference for folks, when we could get them food or could connect them to the right place to try to get their unemployment insurance benefits.
Yeah, because you still had work to do, basically. It's like you got to go to work. You got work to do.
Yes. So, I mean, we had to make that shift, many of us, from being in person to working remotely. And even remotely, you can still respond to emails. You can still respond to phone calls. So that work for me as an elected official, as a public servant, never stopped.
And I mean, yeah. And even with you, Ashanti, because I mean, you've been in college the whole time, right? So you just like, I can guarantee you, because I work at a university, the work don't stop. Even they're like, oh, don't come into work, but the work don't stop. So get to work. And you also were involved with like protesting and the other pandemic, right? The movement for Black lives being shot down in the street and in our homes and everywhere else, right? How has that shifted for you, even in that other shift? Because we had the initial shift of sit down, read your books, figure out how to be by yourself, but at the same time, get out here and do the thing. Anyway, has that impacted your relationship to pleasure? Had that?
Yeah.
How did it?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think on like the social aspect, like socializing with people, I definitely kind of like toned down, and that was kind of like that when COVID was happening. So, but I was like at the start of COVID, I was a pharmacy technician at Walgreens, and I also like about a month, like when COVID was really picking up, and then when protests in Louisville were really heightening, like I was working and protesting and a student. So like it was a lot, and there wasn't a lot of time in there for, pleasure and things like that. But I feel like for me, after quitting my job, it was like, a breath of fresh air, and then I could tone down on things like that. But I mean, with school, it's been a little bit more difficult because I feel like when that was happening, like with the protests and with, just the height of the pandemic, I feel like my professors were super generous. So it was like I could tell them, like, and I told my econ professor, because when we were arrested for protesting, I was like, I think it was either a test or an assignment. I can't exactly remember, but it was due the next morning. And, I reached out to my professor and they were very accommodating. But I feel like now, as we're kind of getting a return to normalcy, I feel like just one professor in particular, has not been accommodating at all to anyone in the class. And it's like, I think people fail to remember this is still a pandemic. Like, a lot of people, I think people don't realize how many people have been lost to the pandemic. And I think people forget and don't realize that people have lost loved ones. And so people are still grieving people that aren't here. And the fact that people have lost loved ones that sometimes they couldn't even see, they couldn't even go to the hospital because they're not direct family members. And it's like the trauma of that, the trauma still of, if you were protesting on the front lines, like being tear gassed, being arrested, just constantly being in fear of like white supremacists, vigilantes coming down, doing whatever they do. And like just that constant fear and paranoia. And then people just think we can just return to normalcy. And I'm like, what is normal? Like, we can't just act like didn't nothing happen and we didn't lose all the people we've lost. Like, I just think that it's weird. It's very odd that everybody's trying to act like, we're vaccinated, COVID's over, and it's not at all.
It's not, no. Yeah, yes. So much of that pleasure seeking and centering yourself is either mutually exclusive because you have to make a choice between taking care of yourself and getting things done, or how are you all managing that day to day, especially even as an elected official, right? Because you have demands of the people all the time.
Well, one of the things I will say is during the uprisings last year at Injustice Square, there were therapists for protester wellness, and I'm really grateful for that. And while I didn't take advantage last year, those things began to weigh on me this year, right? Like, I don't know if people understand that because we may not be occupying the square 24/7 doesn't mean we haven't still felt the impacts of everything that happened, that collective trauma that you mentioned, the tear gassing, the arrest, the running for our lives, all of it. It took its toll. And so I've started seeing a therapist. And so that has been another place of gratitude, right? Of being able to have someone that I could go to with so much of the weight of trying to show up for people, trying to speak out and be a voice for folks who may not be able to be in the halls of Frankfurt, and to continue to stand up. That weighs heavily. And so if I'm going to be able to find what pleasure means to me or continue to pursue pleasure, I have to be in the right place physically, emotionally, mentally, financially, spiritually, all of that.
Yeah. What about you, Ashanti?
Yeah, I think for me, I don't really have like a stress management plan or anything like that. But I mean, I do like to retail therapy. I'm not gonna lie, like that's I de-stress, and even like I try to TikTok is very good for like finding strategies and like things like that. Like, people think TikTok is just like dance videos or nothing like and stuff like that. But I've learned so much from TikTok. Like, you can literally, there's TikTok courses out there that you could, put them up against a college degree. No,
in what, 15 seconds too? So we have, there's YouTube University and TikTok College. That's real life, right?
But like, there's this movement on TikTok. It's about like romanticizing your life, and I really like that. And it's like where you find pleasure in like the little things. So like, you go and you get Heine Brothers coffee, and it's like you just appreciate and kind of like almost like a meditation over like your coffee. And I feel like that helps me just have like little moments where, if I'm going through a lot in a day, or like I'm looking at my to-do list like, but
Yeah.
I like, find something small that can help me like rest and relax. But Netflix is always a good stress reliever for me because I'm just like, I'll go watch Squid Game or something and I won't even think about the world. I'll just be in my zone.
Are those things mutually exclusive, right? Do you have to zone? Because, they talk about if you're mindless, then you're not really thinking about what's going on. But sometimes that hurts. Sometimes I don't know that that's taking care of yourself to zone in all the time. I mean, what are your all's thoughts on that? Like thinking about your ways of taking care of yourself in those day-to-days when you're like, this is too much.
Right. I think that zoning out, I really think goes back to the school system of why that gets like a negative connotation, because I just remember like teachers that will get on students because you're zoned out in my class, and like they're just, I think that's where kind of the negativity towards that comes from. But I think zoning out isn't important, and people do it in all types of ways. Like some people, if they're like chefs and into cooking, like they just, don't think about the world. They just think about like making a nice dish and stuff like that. I think both are equally important. And I think they're kind of exclusive, because I feel like when you zone out, like you're just kind of like not worrying about something else, versus when you zone in, it's like hyper focus almost on something. So like meditation, mindfulness, where you're just like really focused on whatever the task is at hand.
Yeah.
And for me, it's important to get a refresh. So that's part of that refresh, right? Like I need to take some time for me, step back, maybe watch me some Squid Game stress me out. So that would be my de-stressor. but my de-stressor might be some Star Trek or something. Right. And then I'm able to get back in it. Right. So I'm able to do that zoning in, or being in my zone. Right. There's a zoning in, there's also being in my zone. I'm able to get back in my zone when I've had a chance to step back, zone out, refresh, and take care of me. Right. And find that, reconnect to that pleasure that I need for myself to be able to keep going.
That's true.
I'm Nubia Bennett, and this is Sprinkle Sparkle.
Support comes from the Eye Care Institute and Butchertown Clinical Trials, where they strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion within their staff, patients, and clinical trial participants. To learn more, visit butchertown.clinic.
There's a chance you could make your employer work for you. Contact us or your company's matching gift program to find out if your employer matches charitable gifts, like your public radio membership. Everybody wins. LouisvillePublicMedia.org/membership for more info.
You are listening to Sprinkle Sparkle, and I am Nubia Bennett, and we are talking to Representative Attica Scott and Ashanti.
To your point, Ashanti, about this idea of like retail, when we start talking about how we take care of ourselves, and you were like, oh, well, there's retail therapy. I get on TikTok, I do this. It makes me think of these umbrella terms for self-care that include self-indulgence, which sometimes can be considered a bad word, maybe, or maybe not. And then self-preservation, which is like the idea around just take a nap, just do any of those words, self-care in general, self-preservation, or self-indulgence. How do those words make you feel when we think about what it means to take care of yourself?
Yeah, I think self-care is like something that has been, at the top of my mind, and it's been regurgitated a lot from like TikTok and just like mental health and all that. But I think self-indulgence, I mean, to me, when I think of that word, I think of like me sitting on my bed with like a tub of ice cream, and then like maybe a fresh, I don't know, something like, it just thinks of like a lot of me, just like a me day almost. And I like that. I think that that's good for people. And I think we need a lot of breaks, and we need, honestly, breaks more often. But I think that, and then self-preservation, when I think of that word, I don't really have like a lot of thoughts toward that word. I think maybe that's just, I don't know. I would have to hear what Rep Scott says, and maybe I can pull it.
What say you, Rep Scott?
So those are two very important and powerful words. So self-indulgence to me is just fine. You should indulge in what brings you pleasure. And that's okay, right? That is absolutely okay. And part of taking care of yourself is what self-preservation is, right? No one else is going to show up for us or take care of us. And as Black women, all of us on this call are Black women, we know that we are always expected to show up everywhere all the time. And when we do, people don't even acknowledge it, right? They act like we didn't show up, even though we were right there. Or we're supposed to make a comment on everything or speak up about everything, but the reciprocal is not expected of other people. It's always expected of us. And so at some point we do have to step back and say, you know what, in order for me to take care of myself, in order for me to keep showing up, keep speaking out, keep standing up, I've got to indulge in caring for myself. I have to preserve myself in whatever way that works best for you. So those are two words that I embrace. And I move in a forward direction with both of those words, being clear that I still keep showing up, even when I'm stepping back and saying, you know what, let me take some time for me.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Because often, to your point, especially that was my thoughts behind that, and thinking about, because as Black women, especially thinking about both the pandemics, right? And how overwhelmingly, because of the first pandemic, the second one we fared worse for it. Black women specifically, or black and brown people, fared worse because of it. And so there's so many Black women leading, reform for all of it, right? For the movement for Black lives, as well as, health equity and in medical health equity. I can't talk today. I don't know what's going on. But because we have to show up so much, it's like often you hear that self-indulgence is the worst word, but self-care is a bad word, because it's like, no, you have to show up. Because for some reason, for so long, it feels like self-care for Black women is antithetical to the work. Like, you have to just literally run yourself into the ground, or else you're not doing real work. Like, how dare you take care of yourself right now? Like, we have people dying. Like, I know, that's why I'm taking care of myself.
Right. Exactly.
I'm aware.
But that also goes back to the point we were making before about the fact that people are always looking at us, right? And saying, okay, well, how is she taking care of herself? Right. I want to emulate that. I want to model that, because, it seems like she's able to step back and then come back refreshed and ready to take on the world. I want people to see that. I want them to know I step back. Right. I've watched all of Star Trek Discovery. I'm all caught up. I'm good to go. I'm all caught up on Queen Sugar. Right. I'm all caught up. We can have a conversation about all of those too, because those are political too, and they're about pleasure as well. So, but if I didn't indulge in self, I wouldn't be able to be that well-rounded, holistic person either. Right? I don't want to be that one issue focused person, or only able to engage with people in one way. I want to be able to engage with people in a well-rounded way. I mean, I've written blog posts about Harry Potter and its reflections on movements and justice. Like, for me, it's a part of being able to show up in lots of different ways.
Yeah. So what does that mean for you? The optics of showing up for yourself. What does that mean for you? Because if you're committed to that, people see that, like, how dare she, right? But how has that impacted your relationship to pleasure seeking on your own, or in general?
For me, I think of kind of like the how dare she type people when it comes to like Black women taking care of themselves. It really makes me think of I think it was Naomi Osaka, when she was for self-care reasons, she won't be participating in, I forget which, but the whole media, they they just people came for her. They were kind of like that, how dare you? And I I think of that in everyday life, like how Black women, like we're expected to speak on everything. We're expected to save the world. And then it's like when you take a moment for yourself to breathe, it's like, how dare she? But you know, a white guy could do the same thing or do it more often, like not speak on anything and go do whatever, like golf or something. And like people are fine with it. They don't get called out. But a Black woman, you know, takes a break, like a day off of social media, and it's, oh, you didn't speak on what happened in this, da, da, da. So it's like, you know, I tried to, you know, take my breaks, my pocket of breaks, but I also, you know, I realized I try to uplift the Black women in my life that do take breaks and, you know, encourage them to do that, because I think even with me working like politically with Black women, it's like there's so much more hyper scrutiny when you're especially in that public eye. And it's like, you know, we gotta get our sisterhood together and uplift each other, because the most disrespected person in America and the world is the Black woman, like Malcolm X says. So, you know, it's on us to build each other up and just, I like to say, ignore the haters.
Yes.
Yep. Who has time for trolls? So yeah, no, all of that. And I follow a lot of Black women who are elected, who are elected public servants, because they inspire me. Like I'll see them doing their thing, going off to vacation somewhere, or just, you know, taking their breaks that they need to take, getting massages or kicking back on their porch and reading a good book and sipping some hot tea. Like I love all of that because it reminds me that we have every right to take care of ourselves, every single right to take care of ourselves, because people will use us up until there is nothing left and throw us away if we allow it. And so we can't allow it. We have to make sure that we are very clear about who we are, what we will and will not accept for ourselves, and how we're going to show up for ourselves as well. And that encourages other people to show up for themselves.
Agreed. Because, and I even think about, it even makes me think about how we've been conditioned, to Ashanti's point earlier, by our schools and just all of our conditioning, where people, even sometimes ourselves, don't believe that we have the right to center ourselves, which is why, you know, Black women, other Black women in the public eye, even on larger platforms, right? Thinking about like your Beyoncé's and everybody else. Like she took off a few years. Everybody's waiting on the album. Or Rihanna, who we all waiting on the album. Like, yo, where's this album? You're like, and when we're conditioned even to be like, ma'am, get to work. And it's like, when we demand that of people that have these platforms, like, why are you taking a break? You have been afforded this platform. We gave you this platform. Like, it's almost like you should be so grateful. On some level, I could see that argument, I guess, but you should be so grateful that we're even looking at you. You can't take any breaks. And I mean, I think that's the only time I think the trickle down effect actually works. Because even in our own lives, if we are afforded anything, even basic respect, it feels like, oh, I can't take any breaks. I have to be productive all the time. Because also we've been taught that in schools. Everybody's been taught that in schools, but I would argue specifically Black women, because the only way we're worth anything is by what we produce. And it's like, oh, I haven't been productive today, so I'm not worthy of this rest, a nap. I'm not even worthy of that because I haven't done anything today.
Well, I was going to say, those same women don't owe any of us anything. They were doing their job, right? That we paid them to do through sales, right? Whatever those sales may have been. And they deserve a vacation. Just like we want people to be able to organize and form a union so they can have benefits on the job, including time off. They deserve time off too. And those same women will be destroyed in the public eye when they take care of themselves, especially Black women. But then we tend to lift up other women who are taking care of themselves, whether they want to be emancipated from their parents, or whatever the case may be. We lift them up, but Black women, we tend to destroy because they want to take care of themselves, and we always want them to perform. We've always been expected to perform, whether it was sing or dance or play ball, perform until you can't perform anymore. And then when you can't perform anymore, we throw you away.
And yeah, exactly that. And that's why I'm thinking, like, even those of us who just have regular jobs, like I just go to work, and then, you know, I come home and then I maybe do some other stuff, you know, But it's like, if you have any visibility at all, it's like you are supposed to first fight for that visibility, like do whatever you need to do to get in that visible space. And then once you're there, you have to perform to no end until you can't anymore. But we even end up policing ourselves in that way because we're also conditioned in that way to continue until we can't. Which is why, obviously we need each other to remind the girl, take your rest, go get some rest, because that's what you need, is some rest. So we keep coming back around to this idea of what it means to engage in pleasure as Black women. What, aside from the need to perform, are there any other ways that just our identities, right? Because we have all these, we exist in multiple identities, have impacted the ways that we experience and seek out pleasure?
Well, I would have to say, I think about hair as a place of pleasure, because for so long, and even to this day, as Black people, our hair has been and continues to be ridiculed and policed. And so hair can be an act of resistance, which to me brings me pleasure when I'm resisting. And so my hair is part of that for me. It's part of that resistance, and it's part of my pleasure to just be able to own myself and reflect my culture and my heritage on my head, from head to toe. This is who I am. This is how I'm going to show up in the world. It's part of that self-indulgence and that self-preservation.
I love that you actually flipped that question, even in a way that's like, yes, me being a Black woman, I'm expected to perform. So in this sense, I am performing. Look at this hair. It is all mine. And it is, all, and look, and when anybody says all mine, if it is on your head, then it is all yours. So there's
That's
that.
Right.
But also, especially, you always, you represent the Lot crew to the T, because I think I started this conversation with yes, ma'am, yes, hair. Or even that culture around, you see somebody doing the thing with the hair, you're like, yes, 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 loud and proud. But I love that you almost, in that sense, you embrace the performance, because you're like, okay, because you're going to look anyway and you're going to want to say something bad, but go ahead.
Right.
Because really. Right. What about you, Ashanti?
I think with my hair, like I've, I come from strong roots. So my family's always, we always rep our natural, and like, I've always really, value my hair and love my hair. And that's why I was so comfortable speaking out about Butler, because I was like, this is my hair and I'm proud of it. Like, I wear my braids, my froze, whatever necessary, if I want to wear it straight. So I think that's kind of like empowered me to speak for other students, because, even in the case with the hair policy, we weren't the first people and the only people to see the policy, but we were the first to speak up about it. And that's because, our background, and also the fact of the pride we took in our hair, the pride I take in being a Black woman. Yeah, I hope that answers.
I really appreciated what you just said, and I don't want to lose it, Ashanti. You said we weren't the first or only to see the policy, but we were the ones who spoke up. Isn't that the case, though, with Black women time and time again? We may not have been the first to see something, right? But we were the first to just say, I'm going to step on out here and say something, because this ain't right.
Yeah.
Personal is political, right? Which anybody familiar with Audre Lorde knows that. Or any Black feminist person in general knows that the personal is political. And for the both of you, even just thinking about the work that you do, and the work that you take pleasure in, and the pleasure that you take pleasure in, and how that always relates to community, that makes me think of another question then, as it relates to community. How does the role of interpersonal relationships, all of them, any of them, how does that impact your relationship to pleasure?
What you said something that again, I don't want to have it get lost, that peace is pleasure. Peace is pleasure. And those interpersonal relationships for me have to be full of peace in order for there to be pleasure. And so that's something that has to be an ongoing part of the work. Maintaining relationships is work, right? It doesn't just happen. And when those relationships are in alignment, when you're going in the same direction, when you all have the same commitment or a similar commitment to one another, it's full of peace. And so, and that's what brings me pleasure and allows me to keep showing up as my authentic and whole self. And if I can't show up as my authentic and whole self, there's no pleasure that's going to come from anything that I'm doing.
Yeah, and I think for me, I mean, those relationships, it just depends on who the person is, but I think you get some type of pleasure differently across relationships. So like you have relationships with, people that you work with, or maybe people that you go to class with, and like you find different pleasures in that. Your one buddy who always takes the good notes in class, like y'all every time they sending you that email, you like, yes, that just makes your day. But like, in just different relationships, or like if you have somebody who's like your outlet that you're able to go to for like gossip, or like, what's going on in the city, that person like that. It brings you pleasure sometimes. Like for me, it's like I get to get some things off my chest, and that's something that I think a lot of people don't realize, because I think there's so much like negativity towards it, and people think like talking about people, but like I do think that getting things off your chest sometimes with someone, that can bring people a lot of pleasure. And not everybody is as confrontational as me, so like not everybody has to like address the situation with the person right there. So sometimes people like to vent, and I think venting to someone, as long as they're comfortable and they have the ability to receive what you're venting, I think that's another way people can really find pleasure, because I know I'll be venting.
So as we think about, I mean, I don't know that we're on the heels of one or either of these pandemics, right? I don't know that we're on the heels of it. I don't know. I'd like to think so, but I don't know about that. As we attempt to be on the heels of both pandemics, or all of them, or some of them, or whatever, and we aim to center pleasure, how we define it today, and it may change tomorrow. What is a pleasure that you are looking forward to?
Like, I have this chocolate cake in the fridge, and I'm really looking forward to eating that. So I've been thinking about it all morning. but like that's one. But no, seriously, like one pleasure I am so super looking forward to. And I know this is like, it might seem like work to some people, but I love politics, and I really love representative politics. And that's why I put my all into the campaigns I'm working on. So election night is a pleasure I'm looking forward to, because I know that Louisville's about to turn out and turn up, because we putting in the work right now. So I'm looking forward to the payoff for my work. And it's kind of like delayed payoff. So it's kind of like, that pleasure of payday.
That was beautiful.
What am I looking forward to? That's a good question. I'm looking forward to us being able to be in community with one another without it being because we're protesting for our lives, right? And without it being that we're concerned about the global pandemic, but that we just are in community with one another.
I love that. That's beautiful for both of those two. And there's nothing wrong with chocolate cake either. Because my follow-up question for that though ends up, because we think about this theoretical thing we're looking forward to, which I don't think that either of the two things that you are talking about are theoretical actually, but but we're imagining these things. And sometimes those things don't feel concrete, because it's like, I look forward to your point, Attica, I'm looking forward to being in community, and it's not because we're mourning something. As much as I love to be in community with folks at a good repast, it don't have to be because it was a funeral. Let's just get together, right? But what are you gonna do today, though, right? In the immediacy of this moment, what pleasure? How are you centering your pleasure today?
That chocolate cake.
Hello. I was literally thinking that as I asked that question. I said, she already answered this question. She gonna eat her chocolate cake like,
I am.
pleasure.
Well, for surprisingly enough, with me and my terrible sweet tooth, I'm not looking forward to sweets. That's not on my list. But my son has this beautiful jet black Labrador pit bull mixed dog that I'm looking forward to seeing and just loving on, and her loving on me. That brings me pleasure, and it's immediate, and it's one of those opportunities for me to just step back, right, and be in that space. And only think about what's happening in that moment with this dog that just wants to go outside and jump around and play in the leaves.
This conversation has been, like I know at this point I have said this every single time, which is actually very invigorating for me, because this has actually become one of my pleasure practices, is having these conversations regularly, especially because Black women have not been asked how they're taking care of themselves. I think we're doing a better job of asking each other, which is also why I believe in community care. And that makes me immediately think of how we flood the comment sections when people are like, I'm taking a rest. A Black woman says, I'm resting. We are like, yes, girl, yes. And the comment section is just flooded with other Black women that are like, yes, 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 rest, right? Because we're providing examples for one another. And just even the diversity in thought, like as I'm asking these questions, and just really us being able to articulate, something that people didn't denied us for so long. We just said we just gonna take it because it's ours, and it's our entitlement, right? So I am so appreciative of being able to sit with the both of you and have this conversation. And it gives me something to look forward to, because, thinking about this time that we can just be in community with one another, and not because we're fighting for something, but sometimes because we're fighting for something, because there's pleasure in that too. And also seeing the fruits of our labor and on the back end, right? And putting in the work, and not always seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, but doing the work anyway. And then finally getting to the light and being like, I told you it was going to be here. I knew it. So like that feels so good. And just watching the journey of both of you. Because again, Ashanti, I remember you was little, but I also remember when Butler tried it, and you was like, absolutely not. You thought my mama was bad. Watch this. Hold my purse while I go handle this real quick. So it has been a joy and a pleasure to watch the journey for both of you. So
again, like I say every time, you can take from this whatever you need to from this conversation. But one of the things that I walked away with, I mentioned at the beginning, was the similarities and the differences in their perspectives as it related to their relationship to pleasure. In the definition, in Ashanti's definition around not feeling any regrets and just like leaning into yes, 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 this feels good, there's no consequences. Yes, right? And then in conversely, Representative Scott's relationship to pleasure as being able to say no. Like, so but how that felt so opposite, so opposing, but how by the end it almost like rested with, like, both of those answers rested in together, and you could hold space for yes and no at once. So the no determined the yes. And so really, and you'll hear me say this over and over, because I'm a person that just lives in the gray, and I love living in the gray areas. Like I believe in very good boundaries, so that everything in between those boundaries is gray, so that you can live with what seem like very stark complexities, very opposing things, and you can sit with all of those things at the same time. And so I took that away because we didn't explicitly say that, that we had to hold both at the same time. But I think this conversation, like many others that we've had so far, let us sit in very complicated spaces that are different shades of gray, but we're holding space for all of those opposing views in one space. And I love it because it highlights the complexity of what it means to be human, to be marginalized, to be a woman or other, or just diverse in all the ways that we're diverse. So that was really beautiful. I took that. And of course, I think it was I also take away from that just the relationship of pleasure in general, generationally. And I think everybody has a story about, what that looks like in their generations, within their own families, and within their own lived experiences. And anytime I get to observe that generational relationship, for better or worse, really, like in any situation, so not just this one, I'm always very, very interested in what that looks like. And when you throw in that intergenerational relationships, and a conversation around pleasure and what that means, I think that's even more golden, because I think especially with Black women, that's just not a conversation we have with each other. So I thought that was really cool, and I encourage all of us to start and continue those conversations with each other within generations, across generations, because like this conversation today between Attica and Ashanti, in our own spaces, I think we'll find out that there are some very opposing views that are like, oh, these are not the same. 20 years, 30 years made this very, very different. But then we'll find that, like, there are some things that you're like, oh, no, this is exactly the same. So I think that is what I'm taking away from that as well. So, and as usual, this was more enjoyable than I even imagined. So that's what I always take away. That's it from me today. Now I want to hear from you. How did you center your own pleasure today? Hit me up at sprinklesparkle.org.
Sprinkle Sparkle is created and hosted by Nubia Bennett and produced by me, Alex Biscardi. Our music is by Allison Cross, and Mindy Folner does our graphic design. Sprinkle Sparkle is part of the Louisville Public Media Podcast Incubator, with support from the Community Foundation of Louisville and the Eye Care Institute's Butchertown Clinical Trials. Our executive producer is Laura Ellis. For more episodes and to keep in touch, visit sprinklesparkle.org. From LPM, Louisville Public Media.
Support for the Louisville Public Media Podcast Incubator comes from the Community Foundation of Louisville, helping donors in our community establish charitable funds to meet philanthropic goals, creating opportunities to give more through scholarship, charitable checking, and donor-advised funds, and helping donors create a charitable legacy through their estate plan. More at cflouisville.org.
Coming up on In Conversation, we'll talk about financial health. Join us Friday morning at 11 on 89.3 WFPL and WFPL.org, or follow us wherever you get your podcasts.